On March 28, 2024, a federal judge in Manhattan sentenced Sam Bankman-Fried to 25 years in prison. The judge, Lewis Kaplan, said this before handing down the sentence. "There is absolutely no doubt that Mr. Bankman-Fried's name right now is pretty much mud around the world." Bankman-Fried stood and said he was sorry. He said his useful life was probably over. He said it had been over for a while, from before his arrest. He was 32 years old. 18 months earlier, he had been worth $26 billion. He had been the second largest individual donor to the Democratic Party in the 2022 election cycle, behind only George Soros. He had testified before Congress about the future of cryptocurrency regulation. He had appeared on stage at major conferences alongside Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. He had been on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and the New York Times magazine. He had been, in the specific way that Silicon Valley produces celebrities out of founders, one of the most famous people in American business. Then, in 72 hours in November 2022, $8 billion in customer funds evaporated. And the question that the 25-year sentence did not answer, the question that the trial itself never fully addressed, is how a company managing $32 billion in customer assets was operating without audited financial statements, with a balance sheet that existed on a Google spreadsheet, with no board of directors in any conventional sense, and with the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world queued up to give it money. SBF is in prison. He is the answer the system produced when it needed someone to blame. This is the story of everything around him that the system did not examine. Sam Bankman-Fried was born in 1992 in Stanford, California, to two law professors at Stanford Law School. His mother, Barbara Fried, was a prominent figure in Democratic fundraising circles. His father, Joseph Bankman, was a tax law expert whose involvement in FTX's tax structuring would later become the subject of its own legal inquiry. He studied physics at MIT, graduated in 2014, and went to work at Sequoia Capital, a quantitative trading firm in New York. Jane Street is not a household name, but it is, among people who work in finance, one of the most respected quantitative trading operations in the world. The firm hires selectively, pays exceptionally well, and produces traders who understand market mechanics at a level that most financial professionals do not. Bankman-Fried spent 3 years at Jane Street. He was, by the accounts of people who worked with him there, smart and capable. He was also developing the philosophical framework that would later become central to his public persona, effective altruism. Effective altruism, as a philosophical movement, argues that the most important question any person can ask is how to do the most good in the world, and that this question should be answered rigorously, using evidence and reason rather than sentiment or tradition. The movement had developed primarily in Oxford, and among a specific cluster of tech-adjacent intellectuals who found its combination of utilitarian ethics and quantitative thinking congenial. Bankman-Fried became, in his own telling, a committed effective altruist. The goal was to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, so that the money could be donated to effective altruist causes. This philosophy, which he described publicly and in detail, became the justification he offered for everything that followed. In 2017, he left Jane Street to work for the Center for Effective Altruism in Berkeley. In 2018, he founded Alameda Research, a cryptocurrency trading firm, with the explicit goal of generating profit to donate. In 2019, he founded FTX. To understand what FTX was selling and why it attracted the customers it attracted, you have to understand what the cryptocurrency market looked like in 2019 and what gap FTX was designed to fill. The dominant exchanges in 2019 were built for retail customers. Coinbase, the largest American exchange, had been designed from the ground up for people buying Bitcoin for the first time. The interface was simple, the product range was limited, the fees were high by institutional standards, it was a consumer product, and it worked well as a consumer product, but it was not what a professional trader needed. Professional traders needed margin trading, the ability to borrow against positions to amplify returns. They needed futures, contracts to buy or sell an asset at a specified price on a specified future date. They needed options, the right but not the obligation to buy or sell at a given price. They needed the kind of financial infrastructure that had existed in traditional markets for decades, but had not been built for cryptocurrency, in a way that serious institutional participants could use. FTX built that infrastructure. It was technically competent in ways that its competitors were not. The matching engine, the system that connects buyers and sellers and executes trades, was fast and reliable. The liquidation mechanism, the process by which losing positions are closed before they create losses for the exchange, was designed more carefully than most of its competitors had designed theirs. The product was real. This is the detail that makes FTX harder to categorize than a simple fraud. The exchange worked. The traders who used it were getting real execution on real trades. The problems were not in the product. They were in what was happening to the customer funds that the product attracted. Customer funds deposited on FTX were supposed to sit in segregated accounts, available for withdrawal on demand. This is the foundational promise of any exchange. Your money is your money. We are holding it for you. You can take it back when you want it. The money was not sitting in segregated accounts. It had been moved to Alameda Research. Alameda Research, the trading firm that Bankman-Fried had founded before FTX, was the entity that was actually using the customer funds. Alameda was making investments, funding political donations, paying expenses, and taking positions in the cryptocurrency market using money that belonged to FTX's customers. When those customers wanted their money back, FTX could meet the requests as long as new customer deposits were coming in fast enough to cover withdrawals. It was, in the precise technical sense, a Ponzi structure. Existing depositors were being paid from new deposits rather than from their own funds, which had already been deployed. The structure worked until it didn't. November 2022 was when it didn't. The cryptocurrency market in 2019 was in a specific phase of its development. Bitcoin had existed for a decade. Ethereum had produced a second major asset class and a programmable infrastructure for building new financial products. The market had gone through a spectacular bubble in 2017 and a subsequent crash, and was in the process of rebuilding with a new generation of institutional interest that the 2017 retail mania had not attracted. FTX positioned itself as the professional-grade alternative to the retail-focused exchanges that dominated the market. It offered more sophisticated financial products, futures, options, leveraged tokens. It was designed for traders who understood what they were trading, and it attracted them. The exchange grew. It grew because it was well designed, and because crypto was growing, and because Sam Bankman-Fried was an exceptionally effective salesman for his own vision. He appeared at conferences. He testified before Congress. He cultivated relationships with regulators, journalists and investors with the systematic attention of someone who understood that reputation was a product that had to be built deliberately. He also cultivated something that the subsequent coverage of FTX consistently underemphasized. He cultivated politicians. Between 2020 and 2022, Bankman-Fried donated approximately $40 million to political campaigns and PACs, making him the second largest individual donor in the 2022 midterm cycle. The donations went primarily to Democrats. $27 million went to Protect Our Future, a PAC nominally focused on pandemic prevention and effective altruist causes. Additional millions went to individual candidates, to party committees, and to organizations adjacent to the Democratic establishment. He also donated through corporate entities to Republican causes. The Senate Leadership Fund, the super PAC aligned with Mitch McConnell, received $1 million from FTX US in October 2022, 3 weeks before FTX declared bankruptcy. The Congressional Leadership Fund received $750,000. He donated to both parties. He donated from customer funds. The prosecution established that the political donations were part of the broader theft of customer money, that they came from the same source as the other expenses that FTX could not actually afford. The operational details of how FTX actually ran are worth examining because they tell you something about what the sophisticated investors were, or were not, evaluating when they committed their capital. FTX was headquartered in the Bahamas. This was not a coincidence. The Bahamas had a developing cryptocurrency regulatory framework that was more permissive than the American framework, and that Bankman-Fried had been actively engaged in shaping. The regulatory relationship between FTX and the Bahamian government was close enough that when FTX collapsed, the first withdrawals processed in the bankruptcy period were made by Bahamian customers, following instructions from the Bahamian Securities Commission, before the bankruptcy court in Delaware had been informed. This detail was investigated. it was not fully resolved. The people who ran FTX were, by John Ray's description, a very small group of inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals. The key figures, beyond Bankman-Fried himself, were Caroline Ellison, who ran Alameda Research, Gary Wang, who had co-founded FTX and was its chief technology officer, and Nishad Singh, who ran engineering. Several of these individuals were in a romantic relationship with each other and lived together in a penthouse apartment in Nassau. The company had no CFO in any conventional sense. It had no functioning board of directors. The board that existed on paper was described by Ray as having essentially no role in the actual governance of the company. Major decisions were made by Bankman-Fried, communicated to the small group around him, and executed without the documentation that any regulated financial institution would have been required to maintain. The accounting was maintained on a platform that was not designed for institutional financial accounting. Key financial relationships between FTX and Alameda were managed through a backdoor in FTX's code, a feature that Wang later described in his guilty plea that allowed Alameda to maintain a negative balance on FTX's books without triggering the automatic liquidation that would have been applied to any other account with a similar deficit. Alameda's negative balance, at the peak of the fraud, was approximately $8 billion. $8 billion in customer funds that had been moved from FTX to Alameda, recorded in the books as a debt that Alameda owed FTX, that was never repaid, and that the liquidation mechanism that would have caught any ordinary account holding was specifically disabled for. The back door was in the code. It had been built deliberately. Bankman-Fried later claimed he had not fully understood its implications. The jury did not accept this claim. The question that the political donations raise, the question that the trial addressed in terms of fraud, but did not address in terms of the political relationships they purchased, is what those donations bought, and whether the purchasing relationship affected the regulatory environment in which FTX operated. The SEC and FTX had a relationship that is documented in ways that the mainstream coverage of the FTX collapse handled with unusual care. Gary Gensler, the chairman of the SEC, met with Bankman-Fried in March 2022, 8 months before the collapse. The meeting was about a trading platform proposal. The general counsel of FTX US had previously served as lead counsel to Gensler at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The SEC chairman's boss at MIT, Glenn Ellison, was the father of Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, who would later plead guilty and become the government's primary witness against Bankman-Fried. These connections do not establish that the SEC gave FTX special treatment. They establish that the people at the top of the regulatory apparatus and the people at the top of the company that was committing the largest financial fraud in crypto history were connected through multiple channels, professionally and personally, in ways that warrant examination. That examination did not happen in any serious public forum during Bankman-Fried's trial. When House Republicans requested Gensler's internal communications about FTX, the SEC's Office of Inspector General explained that an automated IT policy had wiped Gensler's government-issued phone, erasing his text messages from October 2022 through September 2023. That range covers the period immediately before and after the FTX collapse. The phone wipe was described as an accident. The timing was described as coincidental. These descriptions may be accurate. Automated IT policies do exist, and they do sometimes delete things at inconvenient moments. What cannot be determined from the available record is whether the specific messages that were deleted would have been relevant to the question of what the SEC knew about FTX and when. Congressman Tom Emmer publicly stated that he had received reports alleging that Gensler was helping Bankman-Fried obtain regulatory advantages. The allegation was not proven. It was not seriously investigated by the institutions that would have been responsible for investigating it, because those institutions were themselves entangled in the connections the allegation concerned. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of documented relationships and documented gaps in the documentary record. The gaps may mean nothing. They may mean something. The trial that convicted Bankman-Fried produced no finding on the question. The investors deserve their own examination. By the time FTX collapsed in November 2022, the company had raised approximately $1.9 billion from institutional investors since 2019. The investor list reads like a catalogue of the most sophisticated capital allocators in the world. Sequoia Capital invested $214 million. Sequoia is not a naive fund. It is one of the most respected venture capital firms in history, with investments in Apple, Google, and PayPal among hundreds of successful bets. It employs former founders, former operators, and financial professionals who have spent careers evaluating whether companies are real. SoftBank invested approximately $100 million. Tiger Global invested approximately $38 million. BlackRock invested through a fund. Temasek, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, invested approximately $225 million and conducted what it described as an 8-month extensive review of FTX's finances before investing, finding no red flags. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, the retirement savings of Canadian teachers, invested $95 million. When FTX collapsed, every one of these investors wrote their investment to zero. Sequoia sent its limited partners a letter that said, "We are in the business of taking risk. Some investments will surprise to the upside and some will surprise to the downside." That letter is worth examining for what it does not say. It does not say that Sequoia's due diligence process failed. It does not say that the questions a competent due diligence process would have asked were not asked. It does not say that the absence of audited financial statements, the absence of a functioning board of directors, the absence of basic organizational infrastructure that any legitimate financial institution would have had, it does not say that these absences should have been identified and acted upon before $214 million was committed. It says some investments surprised to the downside. In September 2022, 2 months before the FTX collapse, Sequoia Capital published a profile of Sam Bankman-Fried on its website. The profile was written by a journalist who had been given access to Bankman-Fried for an extended interview, and it was published by Sequoia as part of its portfolio company content, the kind of celebratory material that venture capital firms produce about their investments. The profile was titled "Sam Bankman-Fried has a savior complex and maybe that's okay." It described him as a genius, a visionary, a person whose commitment to effective altruism gave his money-making a moral dimension that distinguished him from ordinary financial operators. It quoted him discussing his philosophy at length. It described him playing the video game League of Legends during their interview, multitasking in a way the journalist found impressive rather than concerning. The profile was deleted from Sequoia's website on November 10, 2022, 3 days after the collapse began. Before it was deleted, it was archived by several outlets, and the specific details of what Sequoia was celebrating in September 2022 about a company that John Ray would describe in December 2022 as unprecedented in its absence of corporate controls are available to anyone who wants to read them. What the profile reveals is not that Sequoia was complicit in the fraud. What it reveals is that the due diligence process that led to a $214 million investment was significantly influenced by the same factors that led journalists and conference organizers and politicians to embrace Bankman-Fried: his personal presentation, his philosophical framework, his ability to communicate a vision of technology-enabled doing good that the specific cultural moment of 2020 and 2021 was predisposed to receive favorably. The due diligence was social rather than financial. The $214 million was invested in a person and a story, rather than in audited financial statements and verified operational infrastructure, because the person and the story were compelling, and the financial statements and operational infrastructure either did not exist in the form that due diligence would have required, or were not examined with the rigor that the amount of money at stake would seem to demand. Sequoia's apology to its limited partners for the loss did not address this. The apology described a company that had misled them. It did not describe a due diligence process that should have caught what the company was. The $214 million belonged ultimately to the pension funds and endowments and institutional investors that had committed capital to Sequoia's funds. Some of those investors were themselves required to explain to their own beneficiaries why money designated for retirement security or educational endowment had found its way into a company with no audited financial statements, run by a group of people living together in a Nassau penthouse. Those explanations were private. They have not been published. John Ray, who replaced Bankman-Fried as CEO of FTX when it filed for bankruptcy, and who spent the subsequent years untangling what the company actually was, submitted a court filing before sentencing that described FTX as having concentrated control in the hands of a very small group of inexperienced, unsophisticated, and potentially compromised individuals. He described the operation Bankman-Fried left behind as neither solvent nor safe. These words describe a company that sophisticated investors had valued at $32 billion 18 months before Ray wrote them. The question of how a company that was neither solvent nor safe at its peak had been valued at $32 billion by the most sophisticated investors in the world is not a question that any of those investors were required to answer publicly. They lost money. Under the law, they were victims. The law's definition of victim in this context ends the inquiry at the same point where the most interesting questions begin. The effective altruism dimension of the FTX story was covered extensively in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, and then, with some speed, dropped. Bankman-Fried had been one of the most prominent public faces of the effective altruism movement. He had spoken at EA conferences, he had funded EA causes, including pandemic prevention and animal welfare organizations. He had articulated in interviews and public statements a philosophy that framed his money-making as instrumental to his giving, that the entire FTX enterprise was a machine for generating resources to do good in the world. The effective altruism organizations that had received his money moved quickly to distance themselves from him after the collapse. Some returned donations, some issued statements distinguishing their philosophy from his conduct. The movement went through a period of public examination that was uncomfortable and, within the EA community, serious. What the examination produced was a conclusion that Bankman-Fried had misapplied EA principles, that his conduct was inconsistent with the movement's genuine commitment to honesty and transparency, and that the movement itself should not be held responsible for the actions of someone who claimed its affiliation while violating its core commitments. This conclusion may be correct. It is also the conclusion that was most useful to the institutions and people who had benefited from their association with Bankman-Fried while he appeared to be succeeding. The politicians who received his money returned some of it, or donated it to charity. The investors wrote it off as a loss. The regulators whose text messages were erased moved on to other matters. The effective altruism movement issued its statements and continued its work. Bankman-Fried went to prison for 25 years. He was, in a precise and documented sense, guilty of what he was convicted of. The jury convicted him on 7 counts. The evidence was substantial. The judge found him unrepentant. He was also, in a sense that the trial's verdict did not fully capture, the node through which an entire system's failures were routed. The sophisticated investors who did not look at the balance sheets. The regulators whose communications were wiped. The politicians from both parties who accepted the money and asked no public questions about its source. The journalists and conference organizers who celebrated him. The effective altruist community that provided philosophical cover for the logic that the ends justified the means. All of those actors are present in the FTX story. None of them were in the dock. Sam Bankman-Fried is currently incarcerated at FCI Canaan, a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. He's 32 years old. His projected release date, absent appeal or clemency, is sometime in the 2040s. He has, from prison, continued to communicate with the outside world. He has posted on social media through intermediaries. He has given interviews through written correspondence. He has maintained, in a way that the judge at his sentencing found unconvincing, that the FTX collapse was the result of mismanagement rather than theft, a liquidity crisis rather than a fraud. The judge said the jury did not buy this version of events. The judge was correct that the jury did not buy it. Whether any version of the events is fully captured by the verdict is the question that prison leaves open. His parents, the 2 Stanford law professors, spent the period of his prosecution publicly supporting him and have continued to do so. His mother, Barbara Fried, whose Democratic fundraising circles overlapped with the political world her son was purchasing access to, has not been charged with anything. His father, Joseph Bankman, the tax law expert whose advice was sought on FTX's tax structuring, and who was listed as an employee of FTX, signed a settlement with the FTX bankruptcy estate without admitting wrongdoing. Carolyn Ellison, who ran Alameda Research and who was Bankman-Fried's romantic partner during part of the period in question, pleaded guilty and cooperated with the government. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison in September 2024. She served significantly less time than Bankman-Fried and has since been released. Gary Wang and Nishad Singh, the other key cooperating witnesses, received sentences of time served or probation, in recognition of their cooperation. The people around Sam Bankman-Fried have had outcomes that are worth tracing because they describe the specific shape of accountability that the FTX collapse produced. Caroline Ellison ran Alameda Research. She was the person most directly responsible for the day-to-day management of the customer funds that Alameda was using. She maintained, at Bankman-Fried's direction, multiple versions of Alameda's balance sheet, different presentations of the same data that showed different things depending on who was asking. She pleaded guilty in December 2022 to 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She cooperated extensively with the government. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison in September 2024. She has been released. Gary Wang built the backdoor in FTX's code. He pleaded guilty in December 2022 and cooperated with the government. He was sentenced to time served and 3 years of supervised release. Nishad Singh managed engineering. He pleaded guilty in February 2023 and cooperated. He was sentenced to time served and 3 years of supervised release. Ryan Salami was co-CEO of FTX's Bahamian subsidiary. He pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations and operating an unlicensed money transmitting business. He was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, a sentence that was heavier than the other cooperators received, and that his lawyers attributed in part to his relative lack of cooperation with the government's investigation. The 4 cooperating witnesses received, combined, significantly less prison time than the man they cooperated against. This is standard practice in federal criminal cooperation, and it produces the outcomes it is designed to produce. It encourages people to testify against the person at the top of the organization. It also produces an outcome in which the people who built the backdoor, maintained the false balance sheets, and managed the customer funds that were being misappropriated are free, and the person who directed them is serving 25 years. This distribution of accountability is the standard distribution. It reflects the law's judgment that the person who directed the fraud is most culpable. It does not reflect, and was never designed to reflect, a comprehensive accounting of how an $8 billion fraud operated undetected for years inside a company that the most sophisticated investors in the world had valued at $32 billion. Joseph Bankman, SBF's father, was not charged with a crime. He settled civil claims with the FTX bankruptcy estate for approximately $10 million without admitting wrongdoing. He had been an active participant in FTX's operations, including its tax planning and its Bahamian regulatory relationships. The settlement terms required him to cooperate with the bankruptcy estate's ongoing recovery efforts. Barbara Fried, SBF's mother, was not charged. She'd been involved in the political fundraising activities that SBF's donations connected to, and she'd received $1 million from FTX for a political organization she was associated with. She returned the money. The family has continued to maintain publicly that their son was not guilty of what he was convicted of. On November 2nd, 2022, Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao tweeted that he was liquidating Binance's holdings of FTT, the token issued by FTX. The tweet triggered a run on FTX that the exchange could not meet because the customer deposits that should have been available to return were not there. They had been moved to Alameda Research, where they had been used to fund investments, political donations, real estate, celebrity endorsements, and the various expenses of an organization that was spending money it did not have at a rate that its actual revenues could not support. The Binance tweet was the match. The dry timber had been accumulating for years. Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, was himself later convicted of violating the Bank Secrecy Act and related charges through Binance's failures to prevent money laundering. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and fined $4 billion. He served his sentence and was released in September 2024. The man whose tweet triggered the FTX collapse spent 4 months in prison. The man whose fraud the tweet exposed spent 25 years. These two facts sit next to each other without requiring additional commentary. They describe an ecosystem in which the consequences of involvement with the collapse of FTX were distributed according to a logic that had less to do with the scale of harm caused than with whether you were the one whose name was on the exchange. The $32 billion valuation of FTX at its peak is the number that, in retrospect, most requires explanation. A company worth $32 billion in the most sophisticated private markets in the world, funded by the most credentialed investors, operating in a sector that regulators were actively monitoring, was simultaneously running on a spreadsheet, commingling customer funds with a related hedge fund, operating without audited financial statements, and controlled by a small group of people living together in a polyamorous household in the Bahamas. John Ray, the bankruptcy CEO, described the situation as a complete failure of corporate controls. He had cleaned up Enron. He said in court filings that the FTX situation was, in his experience, unprecedented. The investors who funded a company that Ray later described as unprecedented in its absence of corporate controls said, after the collapse, that they had been misled. Sequoia said SBF misled and deceived them. Temasek said its extensive 8-month review had found no red flags. The review that found no red flags in a company with no audited financial statements, no board of directors, and no separation between customer funds and the founder's investment vehicle. That review's methodology has not been publicly explained by Temasek. The $32 billion valuation was produced by investors who either did not discover these things or discovered them and invested anyway. Both possibilities require an explanation that the victim's framework of the criminal trial did not require those investors to provide. The criminal justice system answered the question of who was guilty. It did not answer the question of how. Sam Bankman-Fried stole $8 billion from customers and is serving 25 years. This is the correct outcome for what he did. It is not the complete accounting of what happened. The complete accounting remains, like Gary Gensler's text messages, unavailable.